My guest, Charles Bellinger, is Associate Professor of Theology and Ethics at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. He's the author of Jesus versus Abortion. They know not what they do. Charles, good to have you with me.
Thanks for inviting me. I need to mention I have a cold and I have a cough drop in my mouth, but I think I'll be able to do okay.
Okay, if you start choking, I'll stop. So
okay, I'm okay.
Let me ask you about the book generally. A lot has been written on abortion. What do you bring to the table that you think's been missed in the discussion?
Yeah, well, there's been a gazillion books and articles written about abortion, so I think a lot of people think that everything that can be said has already been said. But if I believed that, then I wouldn't have written this book.
Right.
So I think I can bring some interesting, thought-provoking perspectives. And I think the way I would start to answer that is that most of my adult life, and I'm in my 50s now, I've been thinking about the question, why are human beings violent? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of a broad social scientific question, but I'm a theologian, so I've been combining my reading in theology with psychology and social science and history and philosophical anthropology, and I've developed a way of thinking about why human beings are violent. And I've been thinking about things like Nazism and Stalinism and terrorist acts and so forth. And the theory that I've developed in two previous books that I've written, I think fits very well as a way of understanding the abortion debate. But there really isn't anyone else who's come at the abortion debate from that sort of angle, with this focus on violence as an aspect of human culture in general.
Violence as an aspect of human culture then makes it difficult for Christians to entirely embrace one's culture or confuse it with the kingdom of God. So I imagine one has to go about doing the work of discernment. What are the sources of violence in human culture?
Well, I draw on certain key thinkers as I've developed my theory. Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish thinker in the 19th century, a Christian philosopher and theologian. I think his insights are tremendously profound and are still underappreciated today. And so I show how his thought can form the basis, a certain angle on understanding violence. Another thinker is René Girard, who is a French-American Catholic thinker. He was strongly pro-life, but he never wrote anything substantive about abortion.
Right.
So what I'm doing is he articulates a theory about violence, right, sort of constituting human culture. What I'm doing is showing how his theory works with the specific issue of abortion in mind. And then another key thinker I bring in is Eric Voegelin. He was a political philosopher, right, tremendously brilliant. But once again, he didn't write anything about abortion. So what I'm saying is, when you look at thinkers like this, you can sort of discern how they have been sensitive to what the Bible and theological tradition reveal about the human condition and human behavior, and then you can take those ideas and you can apply them specifically to understanding the abortion debate. But that's something that's an unusual angle that I'm taking.
Yes, it is unusual. Normally, abortion is dealt with as kind of a discrete problem, as the abortion slaughter, and it's rarely tied to the much broader, enduring problem of the human penchant for violence. Right. So you're right. I mean, that's. Now, let me ask you this then. So, understanding violence, right? What do you see in that broader study of violence that helps us grasp and motivates us on the abortion issue?
Mm-hmm. Well, the book I've written is more than 300 pages long. So what I'm saying is you have to develop a fairly nuanced and thorough understanding of the anthropological and historical issues that are at work. The gist of my argument, in a nutshell, is that there are these three key dimensions of reality that human beings inhabit. And we can call those the vertical axis, which is God and nature, or spirit and matter. And then there's the horizontal plane, which is society, culture, politics, or, human relationality. And then the third main dimension is individual selfhood, sort of the uniqueness and the interior life of each individual as such, as an individual. So what I'm saying is that these three dimensions are sort of the structural components of reality as it is inhabited by human beings. And I'm not making this up. That you can find this just throughout intellectual literature in general in interpreting the human condition. But what I'm arguing is that these dimensions they can serve as sort of temptations for distortions that become ways of facilitating immoral behavior. So, for example, slavery was what you could call a vertical axis pathology, where some human beings saw themselves as higher up on the vertical axis in relation to others who have black skin. They're lower down on the vertical axis. And then there's many different forms of horizontal pathology, of collectivism, group ideologies, where one group hates and despises and kills members of another group. And then there's individual selfhood, which can be its own form of sort of hyper-individualism that can be a pathway that facilitates violence. So that's where my argument is going, is that human beings are in a sense trying out these different forms of overemphasizing the different dimensions. But when you overemphasize, what you're doing is you're opening up the pathway for justifying a certain kind of violence.
Now, so this I mean, I like to point out that in America we've had a general spiritual and moral trajectory of opening ourselves up to embrace more and more people under the idea of we the people, Jews, blacks, other ethnicities, Asians. And the only place where there's been a retrograde move here has been on the abortion issue, where all of a sudden we've stopped and we've said, no, we will not regard this end of the spectrum as worthy of being part of our human community. Why would that be? Why would, in this one area, why would this be? Why would this happen, based on your analysis?
Well, what I'm suggesting is that in the crucial time period was 1945 to 1970, because during that time period, people in the Western world had the opportunity to say, we've had this tremendous catastrophe of the Holocaust, also Stalinism with all of its tremendous violence, which was actually worse than the Holocaust, and then there's the slavery history, in the 19th century. So what we should do is we should stop and reflect and really think deeply about what it means to protect human beings, to protect the dignity of human life. But during that time period, the dominant, powerful intellectual trend in Western culture was not to think carefully about such things, but instead to emphasize a kind of hyper-individualism, so that the individual becomes, in a sense, the god of their own little world, becomes their own source of morality. And because the moral lessons that should have been learned from history were not learned from 1945 to 1970, in a sense, the battle was already lost. From the pro-life point of view, the culture was already lost. And it's just a matter of the question of, was abortion going to be legalized through legislation, state by state, or was it going to be through courts or the Supreme Court? Those sort of questions were contingent, but the cultural lessons had already been lost. So now what I'm saying is we need to sort of, in a sense, go back to the drawing board. We need to learn the moral lessons from history that we ought to have learned, but we failed to learn.
Any ideas on how one initiates that kind of broad cultural conversation?
Well, I think that really the best place is for that conversation, or the most open place, would have to be within the church itself. Mm-hmm. Because there's so many Christians who don't think carefully about these issues. Right. And so they end up either supporting the pro-choice position outright, or they end up with this muddled middle position saying, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I think it should be legal. Right. Both of those positions are failures to learn the moral lessons that history teaches, the lessons we ought to have learned. So I think the discussion really needs to start among Christians themselves to gain clarity and gain insight, gain wisdom about this issue. Without that, there's no way, there's really no hope of bringing greater wisdom to the broader culture in general.
So would you say then this is an occasion where we need to re-ask the question, who is my neighbor?
Right. I mean, the pro-choice position, part of my book is critiquing pro-choice arguments and showing how various pro-choice authors contradict each other philosophically. But the gist of it is that the question, who is my neighbor, that answer can be formulated in a wrong way in various ways by various pro-choice authors. But Christians themselves need to understand what the right answer is, which is, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I have a chapter about that in my book. The question that Jesus asked is, which of these three proved to be a neighbor to the man in the ditch? In other words, he's turning it around, not who is my neighbor, but am I acting as a neighbor? Am I acting in a loving way?
Very good. Good afternoon. I'm Al Kresta. With me, Charles Bellinger. He is the author of Jesus v. Abortion. They know not what they do. It's part of a series called Theopolitical Visions. And it's a way of reimagining the abortion problem in light of a more generalized violence in the human condition. And it really does... So abortion, in this sense, becomes the fruit of some wider condition. Is that right?
Yes. One of my key arguments is that violence is a theme with variations. In other words, there is sort of very deep within human psychology a tendency toward using violence as a way of managing the problems of life, or as a way of forming social cohesion through some act of scapegoating against an individual or against a minority group or something like that. In other words, the impulse toward violence is very deep in the human psyche. But the various forms that violence may take, how it's expressed, will vary from culture to culture, from time period to time period. So violence is a theme with variations. So what I'm trying to argue is that abortion is one of those variations.
Okay. So from the standpoint then of a Christian understanding of history and, the direction that we're moving, what can we reasonably anticipate within our culture? I mean, are we? Your analysis operates at a fairly deep level. I think it's fair to say that most Americans are not at a place where they're necessarily even think there's a huge problem with violence, and don't really locate the sources of violence in their own nature or character. How would we move the discussion on abortion closer to the kind of arguments that the majority of our fellow citizens can handle?
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is that one of the main themes that I discuss in the book is that pro-life advocates sometimes say there's an analogy between slavery, the Holocaust, and abortion. Slavery was based on dehumanizing blacks. The Holocaust was based on dehumanizing Jews. Abortion is based on dehumanizing unborn children. Mm-hmm. That's something that pro-life advocates have said. Now, usually when that's said, people on the pro-choice side just dismiss it. They say it's ridiculous and insulting.
Right.
But the same sort of arguments have been made from the pro-choice side in the other direction. That is, pro-choice advocates have accused pro-life advocates of being similar to the defenders of slavery. And Gloria Steinem once wrote an essay in which she said pro-life advocates are similar to Hitler. So when you point out that the same sort of arguments have been made in both directions, then you realize, you can sort of open up the conversation. Well, isn't the abortion debate, in a certain way of looking at it, a debate about how to interpret what are the moral lessons that history teaches? Then when you see the same sort of arguments are made both directions, you can ask, well, who's right? Who can marshal better quality evidence as they make their case, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one angle on opening this up to a broader discussion.
Yeah.
Another angle is the topic of rights language, because everyone knows that people on both sides of the abortion debate use rights language. It's either the right of the unborn child, right to life, or it's the right of the woman to have an abortion.
Right.
Well, if the same rights language is being used in both directions to opposite ends, then there's a philosophical problem here that needs to be thought about. It needs to be reflected on. So that's another opening where you can get people to ask questions. Well, what are rights? Where do they come from? How would we know what rights are and where they come from? What is the history of the use of rights language in the Western world, and how does that history have relevance to the abortion debate today? See, that's another whole area where most people have not thought about it. So if you can get people to think about it, then you can sort of stir up ideas that are very thought-provoking.
Do you know, is it thought that the right to life and for the unborn and the right to liberty for the mother, is it generally conceded that those are incompatible? Do pro-choice people concede that those are incompatible rights?
Well, see, that would be part of the discussion that needs to be opened up. That is, if someone were to say, well, there's this, the right of the child, the right of the woman, they're in conflict with each other, then you can say, well, why do you understand rights as being in conflict? Why couldn't rights language be understood as promoting a view of reality in which the different human beings are living in a harmonious, peaceful relationship with each other? In other words, why isn't rights language fostering nonviolence, cooperation, harmony, and so forth? Why is the framework for rights language assuming conflict and strife? You see, that's a basic philosophical question that most people aren't even aware of, is a question that you could ask.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's a good question, and again, forces the discussion along. You have a chapter here on historical revisionism under the heading, Many Gave False Testimony, Pro-Choice Historical Revisionism. What are you getting at there?
That's actually, I think, one of the more important chapters in the book. Of course, I think they're all important, but that one, when I wrote it, I really got sort of like emotionally wrapped up in it, because what I talk about in that chapter is that there is this document called the Webster Historian's Brief, which was submitted to the Supreme Court by pro-choice advocates. And they were painting a picture of the history of abortion law in the United States and arguing that from a pro-choice point of view. Well, if you look carefully at that Webster Historian's Brief, it turns out that it's a tissue of outright lies. It's distortions, it's lies, it's leaving out any evidence that contradicts the case that's being made. It's just absolutely awful. And the thing is that the authors of this document, the pro-choice authors, they've gone on record publicly admitting that these were lies.
No.
You know, that's just amazingly instructive. So that, you know, the text of the Roe v. Wade decision that was written by Justice Blackmun has a historical narrative as part of the decision.
Right.
And that narrative is just completely false.
Yes.
So the fact that the pro-choice historical narrative is a tissue of lies is tremendously important, because that's really the Achilles heel, I think. And that's why I'm stressing so much in this book that we need to think about history more carefully. What are the moral lessons that history really teaches?
Yeah, yeah. Do Christians bring anything special to bear on this conversation, or is this a conversation that baptism and theology have little to do with?
Well, that's a very intriguing question, because the whole issue of should religious arguments be made with regard to abortion, I think is a intriguing and open question, because, you know, many people will say there should only be secular arguments that are made about abortion. It's to make religious arguments is just sort of ruled out ahead of time. I don't abide by that rule, and hence my book is called Jesus v. Abortion.
Right.
Now, even an atheist like Richard Dawkins, he once wrote that he really likes Jesus and respects Jesus as a moral teacher. Well, the question that I would raise is, if Jesus was a great moral teacher, what were his moral teachings? And are they relevant to the issue of abortion? And what I'm arguing in my book is that they are tremendously relevant. So in other words, you can look at what Jesus taught, how he interacted with people in the Gospels, and you can do that even if you were an agnostic or an atheist, and you could ask, how is that relevant to the issue of abortion? Now, of course, I'm a religious believer myself. I'm a Catholic Christian. Yeah. But the arguments that I'm making are arguments that are reasonable, that are rational, and that can be interpreted by people in general as such.
Now, you have a section here, pro-life conversion stories. Is this an attempt to just share first-person testimony?
Well, what I do is I summarize 3 key stories. Dr. Bernard Nathanson was an abortionist who converted to pro-life. Yes. Norma McCorvey was the Roe in Roe v. Wade. She has converted to the pro-life position. Abby Johnson was the director of a Planned Parenthood clinic. She had a conversion to the pro-life position. And in that section of the book in general, I talk about many other women authors who have gone from pro-choice to pro-life. So what I'm getting at is that the stories that are articulated by these converts to the pro-life position, they are pointing the way to the sort of broader cultural conversion that is necessary to change from a culture of death to a culture of life. In other words, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. What we need to do is to understand and listen to the experience of people who have already made that transition.
Yes. Okay. Charles, let me thank you for your work. Good making your acquaintance. I hope we can talk again. And
yes, we've only scratched about the top 3% of my book.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. It's the most profound book dealing with abortion that I've come across in a long, long while. It takes a very different approach. Thank you.
Thank you.